So this is one of those cases that people don't really let go of. Not because it's the most violent or the most shocking, but because it just doesn't fully make sense. Even when you line up the facts, there are still gaps that feel hard to ignore. It's the story of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon, two Dutch students who disappeared in Panama in 2014. And before getting into what happened to them, it's actually important to slow down a bit and talk about who they were. Kris and Lisanne were both in their early 20s, from the Netherlands, and by most accounts, they were pretty different personalities, but in a way that worked. Kris was more outgoing. She studied cultural education, and people described her as creative, open, and social, someone who liked being around others and experiencing new environments. Lisanne was quieter, more analytical. She had a background in psychology, and from what people close to her said, she was thoughtful, organized, and a little more reserved, but still very adventurous in her own way. And that's kind of the thing. You don't plan a trip like this unless you're both. And depending on who you ask, what happened was either a tragic accident or something a lot darker. So first, just to ground this a little, these weren't reckless travelers. Kris and Lisanne had been planning this trip for a while. The idea was to travel, learn Spanish, and do some volunteer work with children. It was structured, intentional. This wasn't some impulsive backpacking situation. They arrive in Panama in March of 2014, spend some time exploring, and eventually they end up in this small mountain town called Boquete. Boquete is known for hiking. It's not remote in the sense of being inaccessible. It's actually a pretty common stop for travelers. But once you step outside the main areas, you're dealing with dense jungle and rough terrain pretty quickly. So then we get to April 1st. That's the day everything changes. They decide to go on a hike, specifically the El Pianista Trail. And this part matters. This wasn't supposed to be a serious expedition. They didn't bring camping gear, no heavy supplies, just a small backpack, their phones, a camera, and some basics. It was meant to be a daytime hike, something they'd finish and come back from. They even had plans the next day, including meeting a guide. So this wasn't them going off-grid. It was casual. They leave sometime late morning, and that's the last confirmed time they're seen by anyone. At first, nothing seems wrong, but by the next day, April 2nd, people start noticing they're missing. They don't show up for their scheduled plans, and that's when concern turns into an actual search effort. Now this is where the case starts to shift, because we don't just have speculation. We actually have data. Their phones recorded what happened next. About 6 hours after they started the hike, at around 4:39 in the afternoon, one of them tries to call emergency services. It doesn't connect. A few minutes later, another attempt. Also fails. No signal. And then over the next few days, this pattern continues. The phones are turned on, signal is checked, emergency numbers are dialed, over and over again. You can almost picture what that looks like in real time. They're moving, trying to find reception, hoping something connects. But it never does. One of the phones dies after a few days. The other one keeps being turned on intermittently for about a week. And then there's one detail that people always come back to. After April 5th, the iPhone is still being turned on. But the correct PIN is never entered again. So naturally, people start asking, does that mean the wrong person had the phone? Or does it mean whoever owned it couldn't unlock it anymore? There's no clear answer, but it's one of those details that sticks with you. Then we get to probably the strangest part of the case. About a week after they disappeared, April 8th, Their camera is used to take around 90 photos, and all of them are taken at night, in complete darkness. They're not normal photos. There's no posing, no faces, nothing like that. Instead, it's dense jungle rocks. What looks like a ravine or riverbed, random objects, like plastic bags or items laid out. There's one image that shows the back of Kris's head, but that's about as close as we get to a person. And the photos don't tell a clear story. They don't show an attacker. They don't show a clear injury. They don't even show where they are in any obvious way, so people try to interpret them. Maybe they were using the flash as a light source. Maybe they were trying to signal rescuers. Maybe they were documenting something. Or maybe they were just trying to survive the night. But whatever the reason, those photos are the last real record of what happened while they were alive. Then, nothing. For weeks, search teams look through the area, but the jungle is dense, the terrain is difficult, and there's only so much ground you can realistically cover. And then, about 10 weeks later, something is found. A backpack. A local woman discovers it near a river, and what's strange is that it's not destroyed. Inside are their belongings, their phones, their camera, money, sunglasses. Everything looks relatively intact, which is unexpected considering how long it had supposedly been out there. After that, more discoveries follow. Not everything, but enough to confirm the worst. A boot with a foot still inside, a pelvis, scattered bones. Only a small percentage of their remains are ever recovered. And that makes it incredibly difficult to determine exactly how they died. There's no definitive cause of death, no clear trauma that explains everything, just fragments. So, officially, the most widely accepted explanation is that this was a tragic accident. They got lost, went deeper into the jungle, possibly got injured, maybe even fell, and weren't able to find their way back. And in an environment like that, it doesn't take long for things to become fatal. The emergency calls support that. The timeline supports that. And many investigators have said that foul play is unlikely. But unlikely isn't the same as ruled out. And that's where the case starts to take on a life of its own. Because there are details that don't sit right with everyone. For example, some people say the trail isn't that easy to get lost on. So, how did they end up so far away? The backpack being found in relatively good condition raises questions. The phone pin issue, again, that's hard to ignore. And the way the remains were scattered doesn't give a clean, simple explanation either. So over time, different theories start forming. The first one is the simplest. They got lost, and everything that followed was just a series of unfortunate events. No crime, no outside involvement, just bad luck in a difficult environment. Then there's the foul play theory. This is where people believe they may have encountered someone, either on the trail or after getting lost, and that could explain some of the stranger details. The phone usage, the backpack, the lack of clear answers. But there's no direct evidence proving that. There's also a kind of middle ground theory that they got lost and then at some point crossed paths with someone, which would explain why parts of the story feel natural and other parts don't. And then there's the idea that the investigation itself may not have been perfect. Early decisions, missed details, or limitations in the search could have affected what we know now. Because once time passes in a case like this, it becomes much harder to reconstruct what really happened. Over the years, people have gone back through the evidence, the phone logs, the photos, the timeline. There have been documentaries, articles, even books trying to piece it together again. But even with all of that, there's still no definitive answer. And I think that's why this case stays with people. It's not just the mystery, it's the feeling that we're close to understanding it, but not quite there. There's enough information to build a story, just not enough to be completely sure it's the right one. And that leaves you with two possibilities. Either this is exactly what it looks like, a tragic accident that unfolded step by step, or there's something we're missing, something that never got recorded, something that never made it into the timeline. And once you start thinking about that, it's hard to stop, because cases like this don't really end. They just settle into uncertainty. If you want more deep dives that focus on both the facts of a case and the culture around it, let me know which one you'd want to hear next, and how you think stories like this should be told. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.